Chijioke was a young man of humble beginnings, known throughout his village as a diligent and skillful hunter. His bow and arrows were his most prized possessions, the tools with which he provided for his small family. His wife, Nneoma, was the light of his life, a woman of grace and kindness whom he loved and cherished more than anything in the world. Together they had 2 sons, Zikora and Afam, who were the pride and joy of their household. Despite the deep love and devotion he had for his family, Chijioke often found himself struggling to provide beyond their basic needs. The game he hunted in the forests provided enough to keep his family fed, clothed and sheltered, and with Nneoma's careful management, they could afford to send their sons to school. Yet no matter how hard he worked, it seemed that Chijioke could never rise above the level of subsistence. As the years passed, this weighed heavily on Chijioke's heart, especially during the festive seasons when the men of his age grade would return from the city. They arrived in sleek cars, dressed in fine clothes, and carrying gifts that made the eyes of the villagers widen in admiration. These men, who had once been his peers, now lived lives that seemed worlds apart from his own. While they basked in the glow of their success, Chijioke could only watch from the sidelines, his heart sinking with each boastful tale of city life and wealth. Depression settled like a heavy cloud over Chijioke during these times. He could not understand why his hard work in the village had not led to the same riches that these men flaunted so freely. What had they done that he hadn't? What path had they taken that he had missed? The more he thought about it, the more his thoughts turned to his old friend Oriaku. Not long ago, Oriaku had been just like him, a simple villager living hand to mouth and struggling to make ends meet. But seemingly overnight, Oriaku's fortune had changed. He had suddenly become a man of means, his wealth appearing as if by magic. Oriaku no longer hunted in the forests or toiled in the fields. He was now among the elite, the men who returned to the village with tales of the city's splendors. Chijioke's curiosity gnawed at him, and eventually it became too much to bear. He needed to know Oriaku's secret. He needed to understand how a man who had once shared his hardships had risen to such heights while he remained stuck in the same place. One evening, after a particularly long day in the forest, Chijioke made up his mind. He would approach Oriaku and ask him for guidance. Perhaps Oriaku could show him the way to a better life, a life where he could provide more than just the basics for his family. Perhaps, with Oriaku's help, he too could join the ranks of the wealthy, no longer feeling ashamed during the festive seasons. With his decision made, Chijioke set off to find Oriaku. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the village as he walked with purpose towards his friend's compound. When he arrived, Oriaku greeted him warmly, offering him a seat and a drink. They talked of old times, of their childhood days and the struggles they had shared. But as the evening wore on, Chijioke finally summoned the courage to speak what was on his mind. "Oriaku, my brother," he began hesitantly, "I have come to ask for your help. I see how far you have come, how you have made something of yourself, and I cannot help but wonder, how did you do it? What is your secret?" Oriaku's expression changed slightly, his eyes narrowing as he regarded Chijioke with a careful gaze. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Chijioke, my friend," he said, "the path I have taken is not one to be spoken of lightly. It is a path that requires great sacrifice and a heart of steel. But before we continue, let me offer you something different, something safer." Oriaku paused, his eyes searching Chijioke's face. "I can give you enough money to start a business, something legitimate that you can grow slowly and diligently. It may take time, but with your hard work, it will be a success. Go home and think about it, then come back tomorrow with your decision." Chijioke was taken aback by Oriaku's offer. It was generous, far more than he had expected. With that money, he could start a small business, perhaps a trading venture or a farm. He could slowly build it up, and over time he could secure a better future for his family. But as he walked home that evening, his mind was restless. When he reached his small home, Nneoma greeted him with a warm smile, her eyes filled with love and trust. Zikora and Afam were already asleep, their soft breaths the only sound in the quiet night. Chijioke lay beside his wife, staring up at the thatched roof, but sleep would not come. He couldn't stop thinking about Oriaku's offer, and more importantly, about the life Oriaku and the other men from the city lived. He thought about the fine clothes, the luxurious cars, the admiration and respect they commanded. They had achieved all of this in such a short time, while he had spent years hunting in the forests, with nothing to show for it but calloused hands and a weary soul. The offer to start a business was tempting, but the thought of toiling for years only to achieve a modest success gnawed at him. By the time dawn broke, Chijioke's mind was made up. He wanted more than a slow climb to success. He wanted what Oriaku had, quick and sudden wealth. If Oriaku and the others could do it, then so could he. He was man enough to walk the same path, no matter the cost. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Chijioke set out once more for Oriaku's compound. His heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve was firm. When he arrived, Oriaku greeted him with a knowing look, as if he could see the decision already written on Chijioke's face. "Have you made your decision, Chijioke?" Oriaku asked, his voice calm but probing. Chijioke nodded, his expression serious. "Thank you for your offer, Oriaku. But I've made up my mind. I want what you have. I want quick and sudden wealth. I'm ready to walk the path you took, no matter what it entails." Oriaku sighed deeply, his face etched with concern. He had hoped that Chijioke would choose the safer path, the one that would allow him to keep his soul intact. But he saw now that Chijioke's mind was made up, and nothing he could say would change it. "Chijioke, I must warn you one last time," Oriaku said gravely. "The path you're choosing is fraught with danger. It's not just about wealth, it's about sacrifices that can change you forever. You will gain riches, yes, but you may lose more than you ever imagined." But Chijioke was undeterred. He had heard the warnings, and he had weighed the risks. He was willing to pay any price if it meant lifting his family out of poverty and finally achieving the life he had always dreamed of. "I understand, Oriaku," Chijioke replied, "but my mind is made up. I am ready." Seeing the determination in Chijioke's eyes, Oriaku knew there was no turning back. He nodded slowly, accepting his friend's decision. "Very well, Chijioke, meet me at the old baobab tree on the outskirts of the village tomorrow night. Come alone and tell no one where you are going, but you must know once you start, there will be no turning back." With that, Oriaku dismissed Chijioke, who returned home with a mixture of fear and excitement swirling in his heart. As he lay beside Nneoma that night, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt as though he was on the brink of something great. The next day passed in a blur. Chijioke went about his usual tasks, but his mind was far from the village. As the sun began to set, he kissed Nneoma and his sons goodbye, telling them that he would be out late and that they should not wait up for him. Nneoma smiled and nodded, unaware of the storm that was brewing in her husband's heart. As night fell, Chijioke made his way to the old baobab tree. The air was thick with the scent of the earth, and the forest around him seemed unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. When he arrived, Oriaku was already there, standing in the shadow of the massive tree. "Are you ready, Chijioke?" Oriaku asked, his voice low and serious. Chijioke nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm ready," he replied. Oriaku said nothing more. He motioned for Chijioke to follow him, and together they approached the ancient baobab tree. Chijioke had seen the tree countless times before, whenever he went hunting in that part of the forest, but tonight it seemed different. Its bark pulsed with a strange, almost hypnotic energy, and the air around it felt thick with an unseen presence. Without a word, Oriaku placed his hand on the tree's trunk and, to Chijioke's astonishment, the bark parted, revealing a dark, swirling portal. Oriaku stepped into it without hesitation, and Chijioke, driven by his desire for wealth and the belief that this was his only chance to change his life, followed suit. The sensation of passing through the portal was disorienting. It felt as though he was being pulled through water, yet he remained dry. When he emerged on the other side, he found himself in a dimly lit chamber, surrounded by men dressed in strange red costumes. Their faces were marked with intricate powder designs that seemed to glow faintly in the flickering torchlight. They stood in a perfect circle, silent and imposing, their eyes fixed on Chijioke as he stumbled into their midst. At the center of the circle stood a voodoo priest, his body draped in elaborate robes adorned with charms and symbols that Chijioke had never seen before. The priest's face was obscured by a mask carved from bone, and his voice was deep and resonant as he spoke. "Welcome, Chijioke," the priest intoned, his voice echoing in the chamber. "You have embarked on a journey of no return. From the moment you crossed the threshold, your fate was sealed. There is no turning back. What is done cannot be undone." Chijioke's heart pounded in his chest, but he steeled himself, refusing to let fear take hold. This was what he wanted: quick and sudden wealth, the kind that could change his life and his family's fortune overnight. "What must I do?" Chijioke asked, his voice trembling slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. The priest raised a hand, and the circle of men began to chant in a language that Chijioke did not understand. The air grew heavier, and a strange light filled the chamber, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The priest stepped forward, holding a small, intricately carved wooden box. "In this box," the priest said, "is the key to your wealth. But it comes at a great price. You must make a sacrifice, one that will bind you to this path forever. Are you prepared to pay the price?" Chijioke hesitated for a moment, the weight of the priest's words sinking in. But the images of the city men, the dreams of wealth and status, flashed before his eyes, and he pushed his doubts aside. "I am ready," Chijioke replied, his voice steady. The priest nodded and opened the box, revealing a small, sharp blade. He held it out to Chijioke, who took it with trembling hands. "Your sacrifice will be blood," the priest said, his voice solemn. "Not your own, but the blood of someone you hold dear. This is the price of the wealth you seek." Chijioke's heart sank as the full meaning of the priest's words hit him. He thought of Nneoma, of Zikora and Afam, the people he loved most in the world. With tears streaming down his face, Chijioke felt a deep, agonizing pain in his chest as he made the unthinkable choice. He whispered his son's name, Afam, barely audible over the chants that surrounded him. As soon as the words left his lips, the surface of a nearby mirror began to ripple, and an image of Afam, peacefully sleeping at home, appeared before him. The priest's cold, emotionless voice broke through Chijioke's torment. "Strike the mirror with the knife," he commanded. The dagger in Chijioke's hand felt impossibly heavy, as though it bore the weight of his soul. His hand trembled, and for a moment he hesitated, his love for his son battling with the desperation that had led him to this dark place. But the chants grew louder, almost deafening, as the men around him closed in, their voices urging him on. Chijioke clenched his teeth, forcing down the bile that rose in his throat. With a final anguished cry, he raised the knife and brought it down on the mirror. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, and Chijioke's heart shattered along with it. The image of Afam disappeared, replaced by the cold, blank surface of the broken mirror. The priest stepped forward, placing a hand on Chijioke's shoulder, his voice devoid of sympathy. "It is done," the priest declared. "Welcome to the Brotherhood." The men around them fell silent, their chants ceasing as they looked upon Chijioke with a mix of respect and cold detachment. The priest continued, his voice carrying the weight of a terrible truth. "On the next full moon, your son Afam will be spirit dead, but physically alive. He will be unable to speak, move, or do anything useful ever again. He will be a shell, an empty vessel, but at your command, he will vomit forth any amount of money you desire." Chijioke's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, the enormity of what he had done crushing him under its weight. He had sacrificed his son's life, his very soul, for wealth, a wealth that now felt as hollow as the promises that had led him here. The priest's words echoed in his mind, but they brought him no comfort, only a deep, abiding horror. The men of the Brotherhood began to disperse, their ritual complete. Oriaku helped Chijioke to his feet, his expression unreadable. "You have what you wanted," Oriaku said quietly, "but remember, Chijioke, wealth comes at a price. Never forget what you have paid." Chijioke couldn't speak, couldn't even look Oriaku in the eyes. He felt numb, disconnected from the world around him, as if he had become a ghost in his own life. He had wanted so much, had craved the riches that others flaunted. But now, as he stood there amidst the remnants of the shattered mirror, he wondered if any amount of money could ever be worth the price he had paid. With heavy steps, Chijioke left the place of the ritual and began the long walk back to his village. The night was eerily quiet, the world around him shrouded in darkness. But the true darkness was the one that now lived within him. The darkness of regret, of despair, of a father who had lost his way. When he reached home, Nneoma and Zikora were fast asleep, unaware of the terrible deed that had been done. Chijioke quietly approached Afam's bed, looking down at his sleeping son. Tears welled up in his eyes once more as he realized that this would be the last night he would see his son as he was, innocent, full of life and whole. Chijioke knelt beside Afam, his hand trembling as he gently touched his son's cheek. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry." But no apology could undo what had been done. The full moon had risen high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the village. Chijioke stood beside his son Afam's bed, watching as the boy's condition worsened. That morning, as Afam had been preparing for school, he had suddenly collapsed, feverish and weak. Nneoma had panicked, and they had rushed him to the doctor, only to receive the devastating news that Afam had been struck by a mysterious illness, one that would render him unable to speak or move. Nneoma had wept bitterly, clutching Afam's frail body to her chest, as if her love alone could protect him from whatever cruel fate had befallen him. Chijioke had cried too, though his tears were laced with a guilt that cut deeper than any physical pain. He knew the truth, the horrifying reality that his son's suffering was the direct result of his own greed. They took Afam home, Nneoma trying desperately to comfort their other son, Zikora, who was too young to fully understand what was happening, but sensed that something was terribly wrong. As night fell, Chijioke's dread grew with every passing moment, knowing that the time had come to fulfill the dark pact he had made. Under the pretense of seeking a second opinion from a local native doctor, Chijioke told Nneoma that he would take Afam out for the night. Nneoma reluctantly agreed, still holding on to hope that there might be a way to save her son. She watched with tearful eyes as Chijioke carried Afam out of their home, the boy's small, limp body resting in his father's arms. But instead of heading to the native doctor, Chijioke took a different path, a narrow trail that led deep into the bush. The night was still, the only sounds being the rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. Chijioke walked with a heavy heart, knowing what he was about to do, yet unable to turn back. He had come too far, sacrificed too much. When he reached a secluded clearing, Chijioke set Afam down gently on the ground. The boy's breathing was shallow, his eyes half closed, as if he were on the edge of consciousness. Chijioke knelt beside him, his voice shaking as he spoke the words that would seal his son's fate. "Afam," he whispered, "give me money. Enough money in foreign currency to buy a new house, a new car in the city." For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the full moon's light bathing the clearing in an otherworldly glow. Then suddenly, Afam's body convulsed, and he began to vomit. Chijioke watched in morbid fascination as piles of money, dollars, pounds, euros, spilled from his son's mouth, accumulating at an impossible rate. The currencies glittered in the moonlight, a twisted reflection of Chijioke's greed. Chijioke sighed in relief, his hands shaking as he reached for the bags he had brought with him. He worked frantically, stuffing the money into the bags, his mind racing with thoughts of the luxurious life that now seemed within reach. He packed the money with a feverish desperation, ignoring the soft whimpers that escaped Afam's lips, the boy too weak to resist. The night stretched on, and by the time the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Afam was completely exhausted. His small body lay motionless on the ground, his eyes dull and unfocused, as though the life had been drained from him. Chijioke, his bags full of wealth, looked at his son and felt a pang of something. Guilt, perhaps, or sorrow, but it was quickly buried beneath the overwhelming relief that he had finally secured the life he had always wanted. He carefully lifted Afam, who was now nothing more than a lifeless shell, and made his way back to the village. He rented a car and drove straight to the city, where he wasted no time in purchasing a lavish house and a brand new car. The wealth that had once seemed so out of reach was now his, all at the cost of his son's spirit. 3 days later, Chijioke returned to the village, his shiny new car gleaming in the sunlight. The village buzzed with excitement and disbelief as Chijioke, the once humble hunter, returned in a brand new car. His wife, Nneoma, and their son Zikora stood outside their modest home, eyes wide with surprise. Chijioke could see the confusion etched on Nneoma's face, but as he approached with a confident smile, he quickly wove a tale to ease her worries. "Nneoma," Chijioke began, "after Oriaku heard about what happened to Afam, he took pity on us. He gave us a house and a car in the city. I'm here to take you and Zikora to our new home." Nneoma's initial skepticism melted away as she listened to Chijioke's explanation. Her eyes welled up with tears of relief, and she embraced him tightly. The nightmare of Afam's sudden illness seemed to be dissipating, replaced by the promise of a new beginning. When she turned to gather their belongings, Chijioke gently stopped her. "Leave everything behind," he said, his voice firm. "We won't need it where we're going." It seemed odd to her, but the idea of starting fresh in the city, away from the memories of their recent misfortune, was appealing. Nneoma nodded, trusting her husband, and soon they were all packed into the car, leaving the village behind. When they arrived at their new home, Nneoma and Zikora were awestruck. The house was enormous, far beyond anything they could have ever imagined. The ceilings were high, the rooms lavishly furnished, and the grounds sprawling. It was a world away from their small, simple village life. Chijioke led them inside, where he showed them to their new rooms. However, when it came to Afam, Chijioke took him to a separate room, isolated at the far end of the house. The door was heavy and old, with an ornate lock that only Chijioke had the key to. "This room is where Afam will stay," Chijioke instructed. "No one is to enter it except me. I'll be the only one to take care of him." Though Nneoma found the demand peculiar, she didn't question him. She was just grateful that they were all together again, even if their son wasn't the same as he used to be. The days passed, and Chijioke seemed to embrace his newfound wealth. They hired staff to maintain the house, and Nneoma began to adjust to her new life. But soon strange things began to happen. It started with the maids. One by one, they would approach Nneoma, pale and trembling, whispering about strange singing voices that echoed through the house late at night. The voices were unlike anything they had ever heard, soft and mournful, with a haunting melody that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. At first, Nneoma dismissed it as superstition. But when even the cooks and groundskeepers began to complain of the same eerie sounds, and several of them quit abruptly, refusing to return no matter how much they were offered, she grew concerned. The whispers among the staff began to spread, and soon even the bravest among them started to falter. Chijioke, however, seemed unfazed. He dismissed the rumors, telling Nneoma that the staff was simply trying to take advantage of their inexperience in managing a large household. But Nneoma couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The nights became increasingly unsettling, with the mysterious singing growing louder and more persistent. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Nneoma was awoken by a soft, distant sound. She lay still, listening intently. The singing was there, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the walls of the house. It was a child's voice, sweet and sorrowful, and it sent chills down her spine. Unable to ignore it any longer, she got up and followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. The closer she got to the room where Afam was kept, the louder the singing became. She paused outside the door, the one Chijioke had forbidden her to enter. The singing was clearest here, as though the voice was calling to her. Nneoma's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, but she stopped herself. She remembered Chijioke's warning and the strange hold he seemed to have over this room. But now the doubts in her mind were overwhelming. What had happened to Afam? What was the true nature of Chijioke's sudden wealth? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden silence. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving the house in an unnerving stillness. Nneoma stepped back, her breath shaky, and returned to her room, though sleep would not come easily. The following morning, Nneoma decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. She confronted Chijioke as he prepared to leave the house, his demeanor calm and composed as always. "Chijioke," she said, her voice trembling, "there's something wrong in this house. The staff have been hearing strange voices, and I've heard them too. It's coming from Afam's room. I need to know what's going on." Chijioke's expression hardened, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. "Nneoma," he said sternly, "I've told you before. You mustn't concern yourself with that room. I'm handling it. You need to trust me." But Nneoma wasn't satisfied with his response. Her instincts told her that something dark and terrible was hiding behind that door, something her husband was keeping from her. She had always trusted Chijioke, but now doubt gnawed at her, and she could no longer ignore it. Nneoma resolved to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. She could no longer stand by while strange and inexplicable events unfolded around her, and the thought of her son, whatever state he might be in, being trapped alone in that room filled her with dread. As the full moon rose high in the night sky, casting an ominous glow over the city, Nneoma pretended to be asleep, her heart pounding in her chest. She had noticed Chijioke acting strangely over the past few weeks, sneaking out of bed at odd hours, his face drawn with tension. The strange occurrences in the house, the eerie singing, the unsettling feeling of being watched, had only intensified as the full moon drew closer. Tonight she decided she would uncover the truth. She lay perfectly still, waiting for Chijioke to leave their bedroom. Sure enough, as the clock struck midnight, he quietly slipped out of bed and crept toward the door. Nneoma waited until she heard the faint click of the door closing behind him before she tiptoed after him, her heart racing. She followed him down the long hallway, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. Chijioke made his way to Afam's room, the room he had always kept locked, the room he had forbidden anyone else from entering. Tonight, in his haste, he had forgotten to lock it. Nneoma held her breath and slowly pushed the door open. What she saw inside broke her heart. Her son, Afam, was sitting on the floor, his face pale and sickly, his small body trembling as he vomited piles of money, foreign currencies, glittering and endless. Chijioke stood over him, dressed in a strange red robe, his hands outstretched as if commanding the sickening display. Nneoma gasped, her heart shattering at the sight of her son in such a terrible state. Chijioke spun around, terror etched across his face. "Nneoma," he stammered, "what are you doing here? You were never supposed to see this." But before Chijioke could say another word, a dark figure appeared in the room, a menacing presence that filled the air with dread. The Grand Master of the occult had arrived, his face twisted in anger, his eyes glowing with a sinister light. "You were careless," the Grand Master hissed, his voice like a venomous whisper. "Now your wife knows our secrets, and for that, all of you must die." He raised his hand, and with a terrifying crack, lightning shot from his fingertips, striking Chijioke. In an instant, Chijioke's body was engulfed in flames, his skin searing as he screamed in agony. Within moments, his charred remains crumbled to the ground, leaving only ashes where he once stood. Nneoma, paralyzed with fear, watched in horror as the Grand Master turned his malevolent gaze toward her. "Now you too must perish," he snarled, raising his hand once more, the crackle of lightning filling the room. Terrified, Nneoma did the only thing she could. She screamed, "Jesus! Jesus! Jesus!" Her voice was filled with desperation, a plea for divine intervention. The moment the name of Jesus left her lips, there was a deafening roar, and lightning struck the Grand Master, sending him flying backward. He collapsed to the floor, writhing in pain, before vanishing into thin air, his presence erased as if he had never existed. The room fell silent, save for the soft sobs of Afam. For the first time in weeks he spoke. "Mama," he cried weakly, his voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. Nneoma's heart surged with relief as she ran to her son, wrapping her arms around him. Tears streamed down her face as she held him close, his small body warm against hers. She whispered soothing words, her hands trembling as she smoothed his hair. "It's over," she murmured, her voice shaking with emotion. "It's all over." With Afam in her arms, Nneoma gathered Zipporah and left the house that very night. She took her sons back to the village, the weight of everything that had happened heavy on her soul. She wanted no part of the life they had built in the city, no part of the cursed wealth that had cost them so much. Once they arrived in the village, Nneoma gave everything they owned in the city to an orphanage. She wanted nothing to do with the blood money that had destroyed their family. She chose instead to live a simple life, one of hard work and honesty. She began farming, determined to provide for her sons with her own hands, no matter how difficult it might be. As the years passed, Afam and Zikora grew strong, their lives marked by their mother's sacrifice and resilience.